Robert Moradi. Dr. Moradi is a board-certified psychiatrist and Jungian analyst in private practice in Santa Monica. He's the former director of training at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and associate clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA School of Medicine. He teaches on dreams at UCLA School of Medicine, the Rhys Davis Child Study Center, and here at the Jung Institute. And he will be offering another program, an all-day program on dreams in the winter-spring, which we're working on the program now. So Dr. Moradi will introduce our guest for the evening.
So my task tonight is basically to give you an introduction to the material that Dr. Teich will be presenting. The introduction that comes to my mind is that every psychological development with any depth must involve assimilation of the archetypal treasury into the conscious personality. Otherwise, the psychotherapy will be used as a paddle to get through only the shadow waters of life. These archetypes belong to us. Whether it's the archetype is represented by the enemy we hate, the mother we love, the father we honor, the animals we fear, the sister we lust after, the lover we embrace, the daughter whose development we fear and facilitate, the son who always who slays the dragon, the wise old man, the unknown child. They all are in us. They are the treasure chest of the unconscious psyche. The assimilation of them expands us, and it deepens our roots in ourselves and grows our branches into the heavens. It is a pity to come to this body and leave without a connection to the largest possible spectrum of what we are made of. Culture both facilitates this journey to our own depth and in many ways gets in the way of this expansion of consciousness. One-sided outlook towards our human psyche is the greatest danger towards the union of the opposing archetypes within the unconscious, that exist within the unconscious. Among those one-sidednesses, the one that has caused most confusion has been the erroneous notion of differences between men and women. Neither one is from Mars. We are both of this planet, and we each have a sun and a moon within us. The sun doesn't just belong to men and moon to the women. They are both complementary forces within each person's psyche. If the totality of human psyche could be conceptualized as the sum of consciousness and the unconscious, the task of the process of psychoanalysis then can be defined as an inner journey guided by the embodiment of the elements in the unconscious psyche into the conscious mind. So that would become a definition, at least one definition, of the process of psychoanalysis. The measure of this integration, of course, is the invigoration of experiences as one goes through one's life. Human psyche, like any other aspect of nature, seeks aliveness. This aliveness comes from living in a state of balance and harmony between body and soul. In other words, living in what the Chinese call living in Tao. Animals and plants do when they are in their natural habitat. we don't, for most part, because consciousness is not part of nature. Consciousness, if anything, is against nature. Once consciousness is lit, it cannot be undone. The consequence is a conflict with the nature and one's own nature. Living in Tao requires the return to that harmony without loss of consciousness. The vehicle for this return is in making of the elements that are unconscious in our psyche conscious to us. These unconscious elements are what our plant and animal ancestors have left within our psyches. Elements such as our instincts that are manifested in our behaviors as archetypes. Survival instincts, for example, are the sources of our inventions, but also the sources of destructive shadow, that part of us that would destroy others if it felt threatened. Procreative instinct is another example that gives birth to our love of another, but also to the projection of our unconscious vulnerabilities. The only aspect of this projection that remains a mystery to the field of psychology is romantic love. This is unique to our species. Animals don't fall in love, nor do angels. We do. This coming together, this unconscious force towards union, is what Jung terms the conjunctio, the marriage of the opposites. This is an impossible unity in the actual life of the individual. But when it happens, it signifies a transition from being part to becoming whole. This transition, that sense of being whole, as long as we are living, is a momentary station that has to split into two for each one to continue the life. So we can't really say that I become whole and then continue as a whole. We become whole and then we split into two, and then the two have to be reunited, and then that continues as long as life continues. However, once this moment of wholeness is experienced, the journey towards actualizing it becomes an imperative. Otherwise, the traveler would have reached his deadly destination. For the life to continue in pursuit of aliveness, the search has to turn inwards. Because if the traveler keeps searching for it in yet another love affair, the result will be the same disappointment over and over again. At first, the inner search follows the path of the real life search, i.e. the pursuit of the beloved in a romantic quest. But then the image of the object of one's pursuit transforms to all aspects of the personal unconscious that the lover had projected onto the beloved. It can be the mother, the father, the son, or the daughter, the teacher, the maid, the driver, the guide, the enemy, or the friend. In other words, it can be represented by the light and by darkness, or by the sun, or by the moon. Once we progress beyond romance, the elements and the entities in the unconscious psyche that stand to be integrated are gender neutral. In this sense, a man in a woman's dream is no longer only representative of her animus. This man can be many other things as much as a woman in a woman's dream could represent. And the reverse is true for a man's dream. He will have to integrate not only his anima, but also his animus. This is the development that Howard Teich expands upon, that we will hear tonight. Jung, about this, says the projection can only be dissolved when the son, or the man, sees that in the realm of his psyche there is an imago not only of the mother, but of the daughter, the sister, the beloved, the heavenly goddess, and the chthonic Bauba. Bauba is a Greek image of the, if you remember when Demeter becomes depressed and she's searching for Persephone all over the planet, and that woman who comes to her and makes her laugh and ends her depression, what she does is she lifts her skirt up and makes Demeter laugh, and that her name is Bobo. Just for you, I had to search for her. Jung didn't tell. It doesn't tell us who Bobo is. Every mother, and so Jung continues, every mother and every beloved is forced to become the carrier and the embodiment of this omnipresent and ageless image, which corresponds to deepest reality in man. I wonder if homosexuality were understood in Jung's time the way we understand it now, as normal as heterosexuality, whether his conceptualization of the archetypes of the anima and animus could have expanded beyond gender divisions. What we observe now is men and women who are born with same-sex orientation project their inner same-gender soul onto another person of the same sex. In other words, a gay man can fall in love with his own animus, and a lesbian can fall in love with her own anima. So we can deduce that all men and women have within us both archetypes. We all have both the solar and the lunar lights within our psyche. This is one of the reasons Dr. Teich's work is groundbreaking. It takes us beyond gender stereotypes and brings us to the 21st century in terms of psychological understanding or articulation of genders. His work, I consider to be a pioneer work that helps clear our minds from the past prejudices of our own culture. For example, a heterosexual man can become anima-possessed as much as he can become animus-possessed. He can become excessively moody or excessively logical. Same true for a heterosexual woman. She can be as much animus-possessed as she can be anima-possessed. It is in the mystical vessel, according to the alchemist, that Sol and Luna, sun and moon, get together to produce Hermes Psychopompus. This is the Hermes, the messenger of gods, and himself the god of transitions and boundaries. He is the god of thieves and travelers. Translated into psychological language, we can say that in order to give birth to this ability in one's psyche to be free to travel between the realms of the mortals and immortals, or to get a glimpse into the infinite aspects of our existence, we will have to be connected to, or consciousness needs to carry, both lunar and solar dimensions of our being. this idea that Dr. Teich will be amplifying for us is not just about the acceptance of homosexuality. It is much greater than that. The notion of solar and lunar light, both within each individual, is about the acceptance of the potential for our own completeness. It is about reclaiming within each person all the attributes that culture had divided between the two genders, resulting in the expectation that men ought to be masculine and women feminine. Human evolution no longer can afford the separation of genders in terms of predefined characteristics. No more patriarchy or matriarchy. We each have both within us. And as long as we don't consciously embrace both, we will project the undesired split of part onto another person or another group or another culture. Solar and lunar, like any other elements in alchemy, are metaphoric concepts. These are concepts used for describing the energies that need to be integrated within the individual on one's path towards wholeness. Jung had only one lifetime to put forth deeply complex ideas and discoveries. It is the responsibility of those of us who have benefited from his work to take his discoveries to newer and wider places. And as you look around, you see that most people who were touched by Jung have contributed to the fields of psychology or the respective fields of sciences and arts. Dr. Howard Teich is among them. His expansion of Jung's concepts of the anima, the archetype of the inner feminine of the man, and animus, the inner masculine of the woman, to include both archetypes for both genders, I consider to be one of those advancements in our field of analytical psychology. His work is a timely contribution in the service of softening our culture's rigidity about gender and gender stereotypes. He proposes ways of healing the wounds that were inflicted on our souls by those one-sided view of what is masculine and what is feminine. These are not oppositional forces in Teich's thesis of human consciousness. These are cooperative partners that are in the service of individuation process.
Well, Robert, you brought tears to my eyes, honestly, which isn't easy to do. This is so many different levels of honor for me, including the return to the third stage of the hero's journey of Los Angeles, since I grew up in the San Fernando Valley when it was still farmland, and went to Van Nuys High School and Van Nuys Junior High School, and lived there most of my adult life, and then migrated up to San Francisco. And I have to honor Jung, of course, beyond recognition, for opening up so many things for me and so many of us, that it's just remarkable that one person could individuate and have such fertility. And I believe it's just beginning. I believe that Jung will be recognized historically by his work on alchemy, which for me has been the core of my own evolution and my hopeful contribution at some minimal level to understanding the central archetype of the conjunctio of the sun and the moon. I also have to honor the first analyst I had in San Francisco was Joseph Henderson, who I don't know if some of you may know of his brilliant work. So here I am in my early 30s, massively confused, as you'll see in a moment, and had the honor of, called him up and said, I'd like to study alchemy. And he said, I don't teach alchemy. And I said, okay. About 2 months later, in a desperate depression, I begged him to see me for a session. and worked with him for about 6 years. And the first thing he did, I told him to dream a course, and he pulls out a book out of his bookshelf and shows me a picture where the book and the dream worked. And I realized you have to experience alchemy. You can't do it intellectually. And I'm hoping to activate some of the imagery that gets activated historically by the alchemists as the history of the evolution of reality and consciousness. And the main focus of my work, that's got a couple parts to it. I'm going to show a video in a few minutes that was done about, 15 years ago now. That is a summary of what happened to me and how I understood the changes that began to occur. And then I'd like to, after that, go on, if we have time before the break, and take you through a slideshow of what I feel the implications are in the contemporary reality for understanding the quantum nature of solar and lunar as the wave and the particle nature of reality that I feel is the possibility to be birthed by anybody, anywhere, anytime, regardless of anything, and happens automatically. And to bring consciousness as the doorway to it, to me, is the great opportunity. And ironically or not, synchronistically I should say, that I do a lot of leadership consulting, and it's been very interesting. The only people I've found open are people in the renewable energy industry, which I feel there's a huge series of messages there that I'm having a chance to play around with. But with this environmental crisis and alchemy go together, because Newton was an alchemist, which some of you probably know, and what happened to him when he was doing his alchemical experiments was he got into the politics of the Royal Society, and they basically said, shut down the metaphysical and basically give us Newtonian physics. And I believe that through line is still there to be taken by every person here in their own life and their own work, and I hope to contribute a little bit to that tonight. But so the most of what I'm going to focus on is the latter part of Jung's life after Richard Wilhelm introduced him to The Secret of the Golden Flower, and how that was really the end of the Red Book work, this brilliant work that's just been published, and the beginning of his really emerging with the alchemy story, which most of the rest of his life was focused on. I'd like to read you one quote from him which summarizes it, and then really go on to the video. Logos and eros are the intellectually formulated intuitive equivalents of the alchemical archetypal images Sol and Luna. In my view, Jung, the two luminaries are so descriptive that I would prefer them to the more pedestrian terms Logos and Eros. The reason is an archetypal image has nothing but its naked fullness, which seems incomprehensible to the intellect. Concepts, Logos and Eros, are coined and negotiable. Values. Images are life. And I feel like his work on activating the alchemical images, including the sun and the moon, are the essence of what can be birthed as a conjunctio and our birth, whether we're conscious of it or not, and to bring consciousness and all the brilliant work that all the Jungians have done. Jung, and one of my great teachers is Edward Edinger, who many of you have certainly seen, as I had the honor to in San Francisco, and his book, The Anatomy of the Psyche, is just beyond brilliant. So with that said, of really starting to use, as I have, solar and lunar, not Sol and Luna, but I've been using solar and lunar for 15, 20 years, and watching what happens to my clients and leaders in different organizations that I get an opportunity to. And whether they're conscious or not, to see what happens is very interesting to observe these images that are mirrored by nature of light and water as the forces that I believe have the answer to some of the beyond crisis level reality of humanity going forward. And I believe that picking up the work of Jung and carrying through as individuals what Newton didn't do, may do something to the transformation of the environment and so forth. So if we could show the video, please.
Late in the 1980s, I discovered a new way of healing the soul. I was deeply depressed in this period of my life and was searching unsuccessfully for a solution until I saw the film The Kiss of the Spider Woman. The issues raised in that story led me on a course of inquiry that ultimately changed not only my understanding of myself, but caused me to rethink the very nature of the way we define masculine and feminine. This new insight taught me how to relate to people in a richer and more creative way. Subsequently, the black cloud I'd been living under vanished. The Kiss of the Spider Woman is set in Latin America and revolves around two men who are thrown together into prison. Melina, an eccentric homosexual played by William Hurt, and Valentine, a political prisoner played by Raul Julia. Trapped in their tiny prison cell, Melina entertains Valentine with stories about his favorite movies, starring his most cherished movie queen, who is played by Sonia Braga. In the film, Braga plays three different characters, all of whom are symbolized by the figure of the Spider-Woman. For days afterwards, I thought about this character. I wanted to know more about her, who she was and what she represented. I remembered the Spider-Woman from my study of Native American mythology and began to do some reading. I learned that this mythical figure is the mother who gave birth to male twin heroes in the Navajo and Hopi cultures. This discovery of twin heroes fascinated me. Mythology is full of hero figures, but I'd never heard of twin heroes before. I began to search through my mythology books to see if there were other instances of twins. To my surprise, almost everywhere I looked, I found cultural and religious myths with male twin heroes. In the Western Hemisphere alone, this includes the Hopi, Navajo, Mayan, Iroquois, Zuni, Aztec, and most every other tribe from the north of Canada to the tip of South America. I began to see male twins everywhere in our culture, in contemporary art as well as in ancient myth. In Greek culture, there are the Gemini twins, Castor and Pollux. In the Old Testament, we have the twin brothers, Jacob and Esau. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gnostic Thomas actually means twin. In the ancient Roman myth of Romulus and Remus, the structure of the twin myth underwent a crucial change. Romulus, an archetype of the sun, enters into battle with his brother Remus, who is an archetype of the moon. Romulus kills Remus and emerges as the blood-stained but victorious and solitary brother. This splitting of the male twin psyche in Western mythic history pushed the murdered lunar half of masculinity into the collective subconscious, locking it away. The mythic structure of twin figures had been forever altered. Like a searing hot branding iron, this primal murder has left its mark on Western psychology. John Wayne stands as a contemporary image of this lone warrior. As I further reviewed Hopi mythology, I found that the moon is a masculine figure actually older than the sun. As the Hopis say, grandfather moon and father sun. I had never heard of the moon described as masculine. This contradicted my own assumption that the moon is innately feminine. For years, I had associated the moon with the feminine side of myself and other men. This equating of the lunar with femininity was put forward by Carl Jung in his concept of anima. Part of my own struggle had been how to come to terms with what I thought of as the feminine side of myself. I then realized how important language is in conditioning our understanding of things. Why must the lunar side of a man be labeled as feminine? The notion that the moon could be a masculine archetype as well as a feminine one led me to rethink what has been wrongly termed as the feminine side of a man. As I thought about the Kiss of the Spider Woman, I began to see Melina and Valentine as twin hero figures representing the moon and the sun. Two men, one lunar, the other solar, the polar opposites making up a whole masculinity. From an archetypal point of view, then, all men and women are born containing both the solar and the lunar. Too often, while the solar qualities in a man are called heterosexual, the lunar qualities are labeled homosexual. This perception is incorrect. Putting aside a man's sexual orientation, all men are both solar and lunar. I began to reevaluate my own thinking process and the labels I had attributed to the basic human qualities we all share, regardless of sexual orientation and gender. This new understanding led to a turning point in my life and eventually lifted me from the deep depression that I had not been able to resolve through classical analysis. Importantly, I was able to accept the qualities in myself that are part of the lunar masculine. As I continued my research, I was struck by how few examples there were of myths incorporating female twins. And yet there were countless myths with women entwined in enduring relationships as mother and daughter, two sisters, or close friends. In Greek mythology, there are Demeter and Persephone. In the mythology of ancient Sumer, Inanna and Ereshkigal. In each of these pairs, as with male twins, I saw that one of the women represented the solar and the other the lunar. This clarified the landscape even more for me. Women's psychology, too, contains this archetypal balance. The challenge for men today is to see the moon hero in themselves, to embrace their own tenderness, receptivity, intuition, compassion, and emotional life as a primary masculine energy, and to undo the onus that these are exclusively feminine attributes. Women have perhaps outdistanced men in the last 25 years by moving beyond the confines of their lunar side and have begun to open to their solar side, to their own fire, logic, clarity, endurance, competitiveness, and goal-directed behavior. The sun and moon are primal energies in both men and women. How the balance of these two aspects plays itself out in each individual is as varied as our people. The either-or mentality dictating that women are exclusively lunar and men exclusively solar is a contrived social construct far more than it is a biological fact. In our highly industrialized Western culture, we have grown so far from nature that we rarely think of the sun and moon as central organizing poles of our psyche. But in actuality, solar and lunar archetypes are fundamental to consciousness, and of themselves they are gender-free. To continue associating intuition and emotion with the feminine, and independence, reason, and assertiveness with the masculine, cuts us off from our primordial other half. The solar and lunar are polarities that modify gender but do not define it. Imagine what it would be like if men and women were to freely express their lunar and solar qualities as each gender's natural inheritance. How different our relationships with each other would be. By healing the divide in our understanding of solar-lunar, we take a step forward in our personal development to find out who we really are rather than who society thinks we should be. And if, as the parable goes, the flapping of a butterfly's wings on some distant continent ultimately affects the whole world, then this act of self-integration will play itself out in more beautiful ways than we can ever imagine.
So that was in the early 90s, and I just cannot describe how my life has changed since then. And let me take you through some of the through line that I believe is underneath what Jung discovered in alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone and the embryo of enlightenment. So one of the things that I have been obsessed on is twinning, the architecture of twinning, and have, now that I have struggled trying to understand some quantum physics and have understood that every particle has an antiparticle, I think twinning is such a core of reality to not consider both and as much as one can hold it in the millisecond is to get caught in a split. So I believe this both and thinking as opposed to either or thinking is what the alchemists did automatically and what nature does. So matter and antimatter are twins, And you just see this all over the place if you're looking for it. And I'm obsessed with it. I'm a 12-stepper on twinning. I'm addicted to it. I've surrendered to it. I'm beyond obsessed about it, as people that know me know. And so, to get back to the beginning, about 15 billion years ago, we all are birthed from the sun in this life, and the moon. And almost every culture that I've been able to see has this in there if you're looking for it. It is in the myths if you scrape away some of the cultural biases, but it's so apparent that the sun and the moon, as Jung and the alchemists knew, were the conjunctio, the complementarity, and the understanding of quantum complementarity as a mindset, as opposed to the tension of opposites in the Hegelian model, to me is what I try to practice as a lifestyle, is how to not get caught into splits, how to pick up the shadow in the moment and have the complementary experience as quickly as possible and communicate it to others, and dialogue through empathy as the bridge to not be caught in a split. And I'd like to talk more about empathy later as what I find to be a real key in the mirror neurons with empathy. So bacterial cells, probably about 3.8 billion years ago. I feel like this is one of the most important images. Jung carved this in 1955 in the Bollingen Stone, which I'm sure many of you have recognized. And why I feel this is so important is, let me read you what Jung says here. Soon something, let's see, this verse is about the lapis, which is despised and rejected. And how much have all of us despised and rejected elements in us and others? And he goes on to say, soon something else emerged. He's talking about the stone. I began to see on the front face, in the natural structure of the stone, a small circle, a sort of eye, which looked at me. I chiseled it into the stone, and in the center, in a tiny homunculus. This corresponds to the little doll, yourself, which you see in the pupil of another's eye, a kind of kabir, or a teleospis, Asclepius. Ancient statues show him wearing a hooded cloak and carrying a lantern. At the same time, he is a pointer to the way. I dedicated a few words to him which came into my mind when I was working. The inscription in Greek translates, time as a child, playing a board game, the kingdom of the child. This is Telescorus, who roams through the dark regions of the cosmos and glows like a star out of the depths. He points the way to the gates of the sun, to the land of dreams. And I believe this figure is the animated spirit that comes when life begins in nature, and that the sun and the moon, which are really the sources, sun and water, are the sources of nature. And I believe that Jung, whether this figure is called Mercurius, or the Philosopher's Stone, or the Buddha, I believe that underneath almost all of this, if you're looking for the sun and the moon, you'll see it, and if you don't put gender on it, you get another angle of the story that's there to be had energetically, imagistically, in the alchemical evolution of each one of us and our individuation. So to me, this particular sun and moon and this inscription, to me, speaks to the real constant theme, no matter what the culture is. And this twinning, if you look for it and you're conscious of it, it's remarkably present. The sperm and the egg, what happens? The sperm and the egg match, these two different species of cells match, and they start twinning. They split and they twin, as opposed to bacterial cells. And so to keep looking for the twin inside and outside in the literature and the material brings a different conscious angle and information forth if you're holding the complementarity of both ends. And out of this emerged the human with our pluses and minuses at this point history, and I believe alchemy goes back about 1.8 million years ago to the use of the fire and how food really developed the brain. This is some of the latest work about how eating and advantages that came as the brain grew from nurturance. And I believe that this is where the alchemy tradition begins to emerge. That is the through line that Jung talks about as the individuation of the history of the evolution of consciousness. And probably about 70,000 BC, 70,000 years ago, you start seeing symbols of the sun and the moon carved in rocks. And of all the audiences that understand symbols, this audience, I don't have to say anything about the power of symbols and images. This famous moonstone, 35,000 years ago BC, is said to be the beginning of math, astronomy, and consciousness, carved into a thigh bone. So they use the moon because of its differentiation for counting, and it really is suggested that that's the beginning of mathematics. This famous picture almost everybody knows, and that in the emergence of the goddess cultures and the agricultural cultures where the moon and fertility began to be the major conscious survival mechanism, this image speaks to one of the reasons why the moon and the feminine have existed in the collective unconscious mind of humanity. And certainly by the time you get to Egypt, you see Isis and Nephthys, the twin goddesses, solar and lunar. Also in Egypt, you have Osiris and Set, solar and lunar. And there's probably no culture that's more interesting to look at for the solar-lunar imagery than Egypt, as it's just all over the place. And you see the dual feminine and the twin masculine there, just in the stories. And I find reading it with this, struggling to read it, because you have to really work your brain a little bit, not much, to really see the twinning as the conjunctio. And what happens if you see the twinning with a sun eye and a moon eye, as Horus ends up in the Egyptian culture, the last manifestation of the Isis mysteries, to have a sun eye and a moon eye, or in China, where you see a creation story with a sun eye and a moon eye. And when I came across that imagery, I thought, I'm going to try to see with a sun eye and a moon eye, and see what that does. And then this begins to change with Yahweh and the elimination of the imagination and imagery, as you know, and the word begins to be inflated and the imagery is killed as a collective archetype, just as in Zoroastrianism, where you have opposites of good and evil begin to emerge 2000 BC. So you start the evolution of what begins to be patriarchal thinking, but however, still in Greece, you have this twin archetype. If you look for it in pre-Judeo-Christian cultures, it's just all over the place. And the Gemini twins, one lives after they die because they're so bonded and they're so connected. One lives 6 months of the year in the heavens and the other one on the earth, and then they switch places. They just cannot be separated. And I think to hold that twinning that indigenous cultures did and pre-Judeo-Christian cultures did as the consciousness that we're seeking gives a chance for a different story. And Romulus and Remus, one of the interesting parts of this story, which is the beginning of the final evolution of the death of the lunar masculine, after Romulus defeats Remus for which hill they're going to decide Rome is on, and Romulus wins, he puts Remus in a walled city, who's the lunar. And he's there for a while, and then he jumps out. And that's when he kills him, is when he jumps out. How can you control nature? But that's what happened mythologically. That's the core of Western thinking, is the killing of the lunar masculine and the solar feminine. Mary is birthed as a moon goddess, the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico. You'll see the sun feminine here and there, but the main imagery on the archetypal symbolic level is solar male, lunar female. What gets killed archetypally is the lunar masculine and the solar feminine. And you can't kill an archetype. This group knows that. It just takes over the more you try to repress it. So I think it's the fact that he jumps out and gets killed is what we're needing to recover, certainly in the masculine psyche and in the revolution of consciousness to overthrow what's going on in this crisis time, which is pretty predictable. If you look at it at an archetypal level, of course, if you have a solar kill the lunar, feminine and masculine and solar feminine, you're going to rape the environment. That's just the mindset that goes along with the killing of an archetype. And then, of course, you have a narcissist who sees his own fantasy, and I believe the cancer of the mind is narcissistic expectations of seeing idealized fantasies and rejecting anything that doesn't fit your fantasy. And that, to me, is something we might talk about a little bit later on, about how do you get rid of these unconscious expectations that are brainwashed and wired in. Ozzie and Harriet were my role models growing up. Like, really? And this was pre-60s. And when I was an old man at 18, I mean, truly an old man, because that was what you were supposed to be. And of course, the lunar and the dragon, the feminine, I don't have to share the cost of this. During the Middle Ages of killing the lunar, who's seen as the dragon or the feminine, doesn't matter. Kill the lunar. Kill the feminine. To me, I love this because what narcissists are caught in is idealizations. They don't see anything. They don't see the reflection that's different than themselves. And the addiction to narcissistic ego material is probably, it's amazing in all the corporate work I do and individual therapy to get a couple to let go, or anybody to let go of their addiction and admit they have a shadow because they have to hear somebody else's voice that doesn't fit their narcissistic fantasy. That's an interesting one to get on top of. And I think this is the burden that we're carrying in the world. And I think it causes all kinds of issues on a physiological level, because if you kill nature as a collective archetype, it's going to attack the body in some way. Whether it's you're killing the solar energy or you're killing the lunar, it doesn't matter. I don't know that it got emphasized, but when I came across this material, my biggest shock from having grown up in Van Nuys and all that in the 50s was I was going to have to develop the solar masculine. That was shocking to me, because the authentic solar as opposed to the cultural solar. And so I dedicated myself to develop the solar masculine 15 or 20 years ago, and it's amazing. My life is just energetically different. I don't even think of it that way anymore. It's just in this conjunctio so much of the time that it's just a different emotional experience. When I came across Kiss's Spider-Woman, Hero with a Thousand Faces was published in 1948. The book that I certainly knew about. Never heard of the twin heroes until Don Sonner, who some of you may know, a Jungian analyst in San Francisco, was no longer alive, had studied the Navajo tradition and wrote a great book, Navajo Symbols of Healing, which I think is one of the best books on symbolic healing there is. There don't seem to be too many books. But Don wrote me back a note and said that that Spider-Woman was the mother of twin heroes. And I had really never heard of them. And the first thing Campbell wrote in 1943 was with Maud Oakes, who was an artist and very connected to the Jungian world in San Francisco. He wrote a monograph on the twin heroes that's brilliant. And it's amazing. He never really came back to this until the end of his life. With one of the interviews with Bill Moyer, he told the story of where the two come to the father. For any of you that are I use these sand paintings. There's 18 sand paintings about the initiation of going to the sun, and it's labeled where the two came to their father. But when the twins, who are birthed by changing woman, get up to the house of the sun, there's a moon father there. And that was shocking to me. And in alchemy, in Jung's one of his last bits of work, in Mysterium Conjunctionis, there's two or three pictures of two men joined in one body with two heads. That was always weird for me, until the big breakthrough for me personally was when I tried to understand that. I knew somehow that was connected to the twin hero story, and the pictures are in black and white, but the description's in color. And I took out some color markers and colored in one of the pictures called, I think it's called The Hidden to be Revealed. And I realized that the hidden to be revealed in alchemy, even hidden to the alchemists, was the lunar masculine. Alchemy at this point was highly masculinized. And when I realized that, I had remembered that child born of the water was the lunar. In the Mayan traditions, when the twins defeat the lords of death in the underworld, they're born as the sun and the moon. I realized that was my real awakening of the lunar masculine. This is a great monograph. I meditated on these sand paintings for years. They happen to be on my website if anybody wants quick access to them, and some articles I've written about the twins in culture. But to me, the fact that there isn't, it's the hidden part of culture, even to the Navajos. It's just hidden, the solar and the lunar. This is the part of the neocortex that holds the images in dogmatic fixation. And to let go of this is a procedure that gets one out of trouble. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that after the break, about a little technique that I have, and I'm sure many of you have, to get unattached, to be able to witness, to be not attached as opposed to detached from the material that flows through the psyche. And mirror neurons, narcissists didn't know there was such a thing as mirror neurons. And he couldn't see that the mirror neurons, and so the narcissism, as opposed to reflective consciousness, ends narcissism by surrendering the addiction to usually the solar idealized fantasy. This is a little thing some kids did. I don't know whether you saw in the paper yesterday, I think it was the New York Times, that they're discovering that autism is something that's not as genetic as they thought, that it is having to do with being seen, and I think it's 6 months, a year, and narcissists can't see. They see, for me, when I read that, what do parents do? They project their own fantasies, absolutely do not look at who the child is, and relate to the child in otherness. So I feel like this whole thing of getting out of narcissism and the mirror neurons and the water are a real doorway that hasn't been explored yet, because the solar lunar in cultures is the creation archetype. And if you're not caught in fragmenting, you get to live a different creative life, whoever you are, doesn't matter. This little bit about this after the twins get initiated in the Navajo story, they go through these endurance tests like all heroes' journeys, and they get named. They were not named at that point. One is called Monster Slayer, obviously solar. The other is called Childborn of the Water. What they get are flint stones, flint shoes, flint knives, and flint hat. And that's Hermes. When I realized that what the Navajos were unconsciously doing was activating that same figure that Jung carved in the stone, and that really is Hermes, that's when I realized the importance of this particular archetype for me, and that the universality of the alchemy initiation, which we all go through as interested in Jung, whatever form we're taking, it's there. So to me, this was a real affirmation of the global nature of this. And the pollen path, I'll just go through this very quickly. This is the sacred painting of the Navajos, where if you notice down below here, a red line and blue line, solar and lunar. It turns gold, alchemical gold here. These two figures are called Eshke and Nahashi. They're the sacred hidden storytellers. And if you notice up here, there's 4 prints, the 2 twin parts of us are walking, and when you become conscious of this twinning, it turns to alchemical gold. And if you notice at the top here, you walk out, the 4 feet are walking in gold, and this white ritual field is the initiation in life of not fragmenting and being able to take the challenges and stay walking up their tree of life, the pollen plants. Notice there's 4 feet, walking without being fragmented in the lunar or the solar. And that if you count the different spots, 1, 2, 3, if I can do this right, 4, 5, 6, 7, and what gets the same structure as Kundalini. And Kundalini has a solar breath and a lunar breath. They're not shy about calling it solar lunar. And so this sand painting, again, is an archetype of conjunctio, and walking in the alchemical gold as a consciousness is a very interesting experience that many of you do and will keep doing. And great honor to Jung. I don't have to say more in this organization. And the whole alchemy tradition, I believe, is the potential. Remember, alchemy is a process. It's not about content that much. And the work that Dr. Ettinger did on this is phenomenal stages of the 7 different processes of the alchemical transformation. And it's obvious you can see those if you're looking for them. And the key archetype in alchemy is the solar lunar. Can't miss even the solar lunar down here. It is just what alchemy is about. I believe starting with this solar lunar consciousness, the sun eye and the moon eye, just puts you in the alchemical vessel to interact with the world. And of course Hermes is the essence, Mercurius is the essence of this with the twinning. Hermes duplex, very common name for Hermes, represents the twins. And of course you have the 2 snakes and the same the winged spirit that you see, the bluebird in the Navajo story, just on and on and on. There's a few simple archetypes that keep telling the story in different cultures as an emergent phenomenon. And I believe these are also connected to brain waves, the solar being beta brain waves, and the lunar being alpha brain waves, and the complementarity, a concept that is kind of hard to grasp in life as opposed to opposites, that working in complementarity keeps one from fragmenting and more in a creative energetic flow. And there's a man I recently was introduced to who talks about the Buddha of enlightenment, the embryo of enlightenment. And I think it's a brilliant concept. The embryo of enlightenment is like the imaginal cells that are there as an imagistic potential. And that is something that I believe is the spirit of nature that's there to be birthed, that's crying to be birthed in the environment and in our own individual lives. Here's his picture of the embryo of enlightenment. Barclay Powers is his name. I've never heard of him. He lives up in Oregon. I don't really know what he does. But here's a guy that's been possessed, really studied Eastern mysticism at a level I'm not going to have to. And I love the idea of an embryo of enlightenment as an archetype. How do you worship the sun or deny it? One's call. You'll look, almost every religion has it as its principle. And my nicest time growing up in the 50s was going to Santa Monica Beach and laying in the sun. This was my life in Los Angeles. This is the only thing that did me well. And now I'm reluctant to go in the sun externally. And notice this great little image. Notice the bridge, the corpus callosum. Notice how the dogmatic solar and the lunar of nature, but I think the bridge is great. They're going back and forth. And it's that conjunctio that we have a chance to have as an emergent phenomenon. And of course, the phoenix of alchemy is that same spirit that's, whether it's the Navajos or the Hopis or the alchemists, it's that opportunity as a creative cultural archetype of creation in each one of us to carry the alchemy forward. This isn't going to play again because we didn't have an internet connection, but the magic flute, this is a great last thing that Mozart wrote, and it's all about the sun and the Isis initiation. I encourage you, if you're interested in to look on the internet, it's just a phenomenal summary of a man at the end of his life, born as all of us are, out of the sun and water. And at the end of his life, it's dedicated to the initiation back to the sun. It's brilliant summary, I think, of this whole conversation we're having. And which way is the road going? Forward? We all have that choice. There's a copy of my book cover, which is in the bookshop. And this is my long-term image I had made for this meeting tonight of the globe having a solar lunar flag as a consciousness going forward. Thank you.